So I came a little late. What is apostasy?
Apostasy, the Arabic word is ridda, and it basically means that somebody who leaves the religion of Islam. So there's this concept that, those who leave Islam, that the Prophet ordered that those people should be killed. And so obviously those who believe in free will and freedom of conscience, they say this is a very backwards law. Why should you execute somebody because he doesn't want to be a Muslim or she doesn't want to be a Muslim anymore? And so the understanding is, looking at the hadith and looking at the Quran, that all of the times that the Prophet commanded someone who left Islam to change his religion, that when he ordered that person to be executed, it was not because they just changed their minds or their hearts, but it's because they joined the Meccans or the people who were fighting against the Muslim community. And so it's like high treason. That's the reason why the command was to be executed.
Okay, thank you.
Khair, inshallah. Other questions?
Just a clarification question.
Yes.
If you marry a slave woman and she does not give birth to a child, does that mean that she still remains a slave woman?
What it means that freedom is not automatic. That's all it means. She can still request to be freed. Many of the historically, many men would in fact, free their, put in their wasiyah, put in their wills that when I die, this person or this person should be freed. So it's not automatic, but it's still possible. Yes. Other questions?
So I have a question about just the history of Islam and slavery, looking at what the Muslims did instead of what the Quran and Sunnah say. So there used to be at least maybe 300 years ago, 400 years ago, Muslims would think it was okay to enslave non-Muslims, and I just want to understand where that came from.
That came from the Umayyad dynasty, that when they took over and they started doing a lot of expansionary campaigns against the Byzantine Empire, they basically, they are the ones who instituted that pseudo-sunnah, right? Because what should have happened is that, I don't want to say what should have happened, Allah is the Qadir on everything. During the Umayyad dynasty, your Khalifa was less of a spiritual leader and more of a muluk, which means a kingship. And so you have absolute authority. And one of the defining characteristics of the Umayyad dynasty is they had a lot of external wars to expand their territory. They started playing what they call the great game, like the other empires, like the remnants of the Persian Empire and the Byzantium Empire and the Coptic Empire. So they started doing this. And what they found is that they could get a lot of money by enslaving either the captured POWs of the opposing men, or the families of the places that they conquered. Okay, so that was kind of a lucrative thing for them. It wasn't something that's Islamically mandated. Many of the wars, many of the campaigns of the Umayyad dynasty and a few of the Abbasid dynasty, they were simply wars of territorial expansion or getting, getting rich off of the lands that are around. All right. The idea that it's okay to enslave those who are not Muslim, it comes from the idea that, well, the only way that we can enslave people, like I said, the only way that was allowed to bring people into slavery was being captured in war. And there's a whole topic on why was that still instituted. It basically comes down to the idea that if you have a society who has gone to war, when they lose, one of the consequences of losing is that you have a lot of refugees. And one of the ways of taking care of the refugees, if their men or the ones who can able to protect them are not there anymore, you take them in as wards of the state. But many Muslims during that time, because this was many generations after the Prophet, after the companions, after Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, many generations after those, they didn't think that way anymore. They were thinking very similar to the common imperial ways of thinking. That's the reason why it was considered okay, because it was a source of revenue for those empires and kings.
Just a follow-up question and a comment. Just they basically equated the condition of war to conquering a place. So yes. Like the Futuhat, and they would just make a trade deal? Like, because that's what I've seen.
Right. It would be a trade deal, because what normally would happen is that, so if they started a campaign and the people and came to a peace treaty, they came to terms, then nobody would be enslaved and there'd be no fighting. They'd just become assumed, they'd be annexed by the Muslim empire, which at that point was more of an Arab empire. It was more motivated by Arab superiority and the Arab empire feeling rather than by Islamic or religious feelings. So they would basically be assumed or consumed by them, and they'd pay taxes and tribute and that kind of thing. Those who fought, they would go through the usual thing of fighting, and then after fighting, those who lost the battle would be captured and they'd be taken as prisoners of wars and or slaves. Prisoners of wars for the fighting people, and slaves for those who are non-combatants. And then after the settlement, then there would be the trade. For those that did not get traded back, for those who were captured as prisoners of war, or who were families of them who were captured as slaves, if there was nobody to take them back or who wanted to pay their ransom, then they were distributed to the Muslim population as slaves to be taken care of in that way. This is the historical context of how POWs, non-combatant POWs, were treated. Other questions? Well, first of all, did that answer your question, sister?
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, thank
Wa
you.
alaikum assalam.
Okay, we'll leave the sister first. Okay, go ahead, sister.
Yes. Yes, sister. Hello? Okay. So we'll let Sister Delia.
Oh, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I'm her husband. So the question I had is that so you're saying that the ruling of slavery in Islam, in the objective of the ruling were actually to decrease the number of slaves over time. So
Yes.
my question is, did that really happen? And if that did not happen, how can we justify? I mean, if we say God, put some ruling to achieve some objective, and the objective was not achieved. So what does that mean, and how can we defend that?
So we talked about that actually, Brother Muhammad. Let me just show this to you again. So if I go back, remember when I talked about Khalifa Umar ibn Abdul Aziz? He freed all the slaves. He commanded he closed down the slave galleys, and he basically commanded everyone to be freed. And he gave money to everybody so they could free their slaves and help them get out. And before that, we had Umar ibn Khattab. So we see that the companions and the descendants of the companions, they had this and they did that. It did actually happen. The problem is that after you have these pious leaders, you have impious leaders, or leaders who are more concerned about money and power than they are about justice. And this is the history of the Muslim empires. You can see this all together. You have Abu Bakr Siddiq, and you have Omar, then you have Uthman, things begin to go down, and then you have the big fitna, and Ali tries to hold on to things, and he loses control. Muawiyah was able to keep control for 20 years, and then it went down again, and then Umar ibn Abdul Aziz took control for only 3 years, basically, and he was able to revive the sunnah that was required. But after he died, you went back to the usual kingship. And the Prophet ﷺ actually mentioned this, right? He mentioned that there will be the leadership of the khulafa, and then after that there'll be muluk, and after that there'll be abiding rulership, right? The kind of rulers that will bite down on the community. So when you say, how do we justify this? It's the same kind of concept of, why does Allah allow injustice in the world, right? The point is, Allah gives the rules and sets the expectations, and then the ball is in the human being's court. Are they going to step up and actually implement and carry through and fulfill those expectations or not? Does that make sense? So it did happen, within 100 years of the Prophet's death, alayhi salam. The problem is that you had impious leaders afterwards that continued to have their profiteering wars and just, accumulating wealth and power at the expense of what the Sunnah actually calls for.
Okay, Jazakumullah.
Wayak, inshallah. Okay, Brother Tawfiq.
Okay, brother. Regarding the marrying the slaves,
Yes.
It was the only way for the owners to have an intimate relationship, and if yes, that was a way for Sahaba to have more than 4 women?
Okay. So It was an actual relation that's called a sirriya. They call it, basically it was a silent contract where one thing you have to remember, brothers and sisters, that during that time, those slave women were considered common law wives to their masters. Now, we have historical documents that show that there were many masters, they were writing poetry to try to convince the slave women to cohabit with them. This proves that it was consensual. All right, and there's actually another. I have a document that I'm going to be sending out, inshallah. Maybe I'll even attach it to the courses document that talks about the reality of pre-modern relationships between slave and masters. It wasn't kind of the way we project it to be. Many women who found themselves in slavery, they found it as a benefit to come under the wing of her master because there was a lot of protection, as well as benefits for her children, as well as benefits for herself personally when it comes to financial support, as well as physical protection. So the understanding is that he would make advances to her and she could either approve, accept it, or reject it. And as soon as she accepts, then she becomes like a common law wife. Common law wife means she has all the rights of a wife except for inheritance, unless she bears him a child, and then when he dies, she gets the inheritance. Okay. Now, if you say, would this allow companions or people after them to have more than 4 wives? The answer is yes. So it's 4 free women as wives, and then as many of the common law wives, slave wives, as he could afford, right? So this was a permission if he could actually afford it. Most people could not, right? Just like nowadays, very few men have the funds to be able to actually marry a 2nd or 3rd or 4th wife. Even back in the day, the common law wives was only for the high societies. And sometimes, one correction for that, sometimes if a person was of a middle or low income, he would only have 1 wife, and it would be the slave wife, because he couldn't afford the mahar of a free woman in his town. Does that answer your question? Does that answer your question, brother?
Yes, jazakumullah khair. Thank you.
Inshallah. Khair, inshallah. Other questions, inshallah. Other questions, inshallah ta'ala.
Just to clarify, so the slave woman is it is like a part of the maximum of 4 wives?
No,
Sorry.
she is not.
No, she's not?
No, you're allowed 4 free women as wives. So the number of full wives, because the wives, they get inheritance automatically, right? Whereas the slave women did not, unless she was freed, either by bearing children to her master, or if he freed her before he died, or if he put in his will that when I die, she gets free. Maybe she didn't bear him a child, but he loved her, or he cared about her, and he wanted her to be free when he died. Okay, so those were the 3 ways that a slave girl or a slave wife would be able to inherit. Other than that, the other thing is that it is not quite required. So we have the whole, equal distribution of wealth and time. That does not apply to those who were slave women, because they did not have those are the 2 differences. Number 1, the inheritance. Number 2, the requirement to spend on the slave girl as much as you spent on a regular full wife, or the other amount of time that she would be having.
Do we have any understanding of why this was the case?
Most of the reasons why, sister, come from the whole idea of the historical context, in that this was the culture that the prophet, and actually even the previous prophets, the Old Testament talks about, taking your maidservants, the maidservants of your wife, or the maidservants of you, to bear your children, or to add to your family, right? We have the famous case of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, that Hajar was, the mother of Ismail, was the maidservant, was the slave girl of his wife Sarah, right? Likewise, we have the same things about Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, and they had 2 free wives, and their 2 slave girls also became his slave wives, right? And so this is something that is in the Old Testament. It's all historical context of why this was allowed. In that what Islam does, what Allah in His Sunnah, is that He doesn't revolutionize the social conduct of a people. He modifies it, he tweaks it, he puts in safeguards without overthrowing the status quo. It's only in the terms of aqidah that you have the overthrow of the idols, the overthrow of the false theology, and then basically presenting the pure aqidah of La ilaha illallah. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah.
Okay. We'll ask for questions one more time, inshallah. And if there are none, then I can hand the microphone over to Brother Abdullah, and he can basically share some of, one of the difficult questions that he was assigned and the research that he found, and then he could be the one who asks, who answers questions, inshallah ta'ala. Questions going once. Questions going twice. Okay. Oh, yes, Sister Reem.
So what is the point of having a 4-wife limit if you can just go marry another, if you have like unlimited slave wives?
Okay. So again, realize that it all comes down to the historical context, in that Jahiliyyah Arabia, they didn't have any limits on wives, they didn't have any limits on slaves, slave girls, and they didn't have any requirements to treat them right, treat them well, right? So what Islam modified is, okay, instead of having all the wives that you want, you can only have a maximum of 4, with the condition that you give them equal time and equal financial support, all right? And then when it comes to the مَا مَلَكَتْ يَمِينُكُمْ, those that your right hands possess, that was not taken away because many of the people at that time, they did have slave girls and they did have them as common wives. So it would have been unrealistic for that time to say you have to let them free. Realize that for many of the slaves in that society, you have a structured society, if you suddenly freed the slaves, they wouldn't have any way to support themselves. And historically, what happens when you have sudden freedom, unless you have the financial, remember we talked about how, I think I put it right there, Khalifa Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, why did he wait until he had the public treasury to free all the captives? Because he had to give them a stipend so they can get started with the life. If you just free the slaves without, because that means that they have to pay for their room and board now, they have to pay for their shelter, they have to pay for their own food, they have to pay for their own clothing, whereas before they were taken care of by their masters. Many of the slaves would then turn to either robbery or prostitution just so they could stay alive now that they're no longer under their master's care. So that's the reason why it wasn't just, oh, what's the point of having a limit on the wives if you're not going to also have a limit on the slave wives, the common law wives. Those were naturally constrained by the financial requirements, right? You can't have more than one wife unless they get the same housing and the same jewelry and the same time. And you can't have more, slave women unless you're treating them in the proper fashion, right? Abusing a slave, not giving her rights. Those are actually crimes in Islam. Abusing or beating a slave, that is a sin. And the Prophet said, if you want to atone for that sin, you have to set her free or him free. So they by stipulating the requirement for humane treatment and giving them the status that they could seek restitution. Before, slaves could not go to court, but in the Islamic law, they could, you see? And if a slave had a complaint against the master, the judges could get involved. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So this is how it was limited. But those who had the money, yes, they could buy as much as they want. I understand that. But again, it comes down to the historical limitations at that time, the historical situation, and Islam, in Allah's wisdom, His sunnah is that He only tweaks or makes modifications to the existing social structure. He doesn't overthrow it like theology and aqid.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, so inshallah, Brother Abdullah, we'll go ahead and open the mic to you, brother. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us what you've been researching and try to give your answer to it, inshallah. And then after that, we can open up for the rest of the people to ask you questions. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you, Brother Ahmed, for giving me time from your session to speak. Before I begin, I want to introduce myself. My name is Abdullah, and I'm an undergraduate student at MIT. I'm a member of Mass Outreach, which is a program started by Mass Boston with the goal of preparing young people in the community to engage in Dawah or outreach initiatives. We've been meeting for a couple of months now, and our meetings have two focuses. The first one is personal development, and in each meeting we read and reflect on a few verses from the Quran. We also discuss topics such as evolution and other interesting questions. And the second focus is Dawah or outreach, and we discuss responses to commonly asked questions about Islam, as well as ways to engage in discussion about Islam. And we're actually actively seeking new members. So if you're interested, there's a few of us in this call who are part of the program, including myself. Marwa, Amal, Iman are also part of the program. So feel free to send us a quick message and we'll be more than happy to talk to you. Okay, so that was a quick plug for the program. Now I'll get into my actual presentation. So I mentioned that we have a running list of questions. From the list, we've each chosen to answer one question. And we went and individually did some research and compiled a response. The question that I've chosen to answer is, why is there injustice in this world? And subhanAllah, Brother Ahmed actually touched on it a little bit during the Q&A, but I'll give my response now and then we'll open up to follow-up questions. So Bismillah. Why is there injustice in this world? The primary answer to this question is injustice is a test. As Muslims, we believe that we were created to worship Allah, and injustice in this world is a test of our commitment to that purpose. So will we worship Allah only when life is convenient for us, or will we worship Him always, both when we are blessed with privileges and good fortune, and when we face misfortune? It's also important to note that because we are created to worship Allah, the greatest injustice we can commit, which is an injustice to ourselves, is to deny our purpose of existence and not recognize Allah as our Lord and Creator. In addition to injustice within itself being a test, observable injustice or injustice that we see others going through is also a test for believers, in that we are asked to eliminate injustice if we can. And there's a hadith that says, whoever amongst you sees an evil, he must change it with his hand. If he is unable to do so, then with his tongue. And if he is unable to do so, then with his heart. And that is the weakest form of faith. And that's from Muslim. And one very important point to consider is that injustice is subjective. Everyone is tested. Some people are tested by what we may traditionally consider injustice, such as poverty, hunger, illness, and natural disaster. And others are tested by their wealth, by their children, or by other difficulties that aren't apparent to us. These tests can be a question of, will I be thankful to Allah for my good fortune? Or am I satisfied with what I have, or do I always crave more, amongst other things? And ultimately, everyone is tested in some way, and sometimes the most difficult tests are those that aren't apparent to us. And because injustice is so subjective, who are we to determine that something is an injustice? So why is there injustice in this world? We mentioned that the first reason is that injustice is a test, and number two is injustice is a part of life. So without injustice, how can there be justice? Just like without hunger, how can there be satisfaction? And without pain, how can there be happiness? So the tests in this world allow us to enjoy its blessings, and worldly injustice is also evidence that this world is imperfect and hopefully leads us to an appreciation of Jannah or paradise. So as Muslims, we believe that eventually everyone will die and everyone will be judged not based on how much wealth or strength they had before they died, but based on their actions and their beliefs in this world. Although the trials of this world may place barriers in our way throughout our lives, we will be judged based on how we made use of the resources that we had, that is our time, our health, our money. And in this way, it is very possible that a poor but good person may end up receiving more reward than a rich, evil person. And as Muslims, we believe that we are judged based on our effort. For example, those who have difficulty reading the Quran may receive more reward for what they read than those who read it easily, and those who are poor receive more blessings for their charity than those who are wealthy. And on the day of judgment, all injustice will be lifted and justice will take place. So any temporary injustice in this world will be removed, and those who pass the tests will be rewarded based on their efforts. So to recap, injustice in this world is a test. It's also a part of this life, but it's temporary and will be removed on the day of judgment, where justice will take place. So that's all I have as just a quick response to the question. Are there any questions? Follow-up questions?
Barakallah fiqh, Brother Abdullah. Barakallah fiqh. Very well stated. All right. So, what questions do you have about this concept of injustice that Abdullah can try to answer? Try to think of all of the accusations, because really this is not just so that he can showcase his homework, as a show and tell, but also so that we can, train Abdullah and Sister Marwa and the other people of the mass outreach team how to stay, poise and compassion when responding to these kind of questions. So think about when someone says, oh, there's so much pain and suffering in the world, and they've been accusing you of certain things. Go ahead and take those questions and reflect them onto Brother Abdullah, so he can also get some practice, inshallah ta'ala, responding to that.
Well, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I'll do my best to answer questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
How would you respond to someone calling you a terrorist?
To someone calling me a terrorist?
Yeah.
Well,
Brother Abdullah, this happens. You
Yes.
ask any questions about this topic, and you get a question about a different topic that takes you off guard. Yallah.
yes, of course.
Stand up and deliver.
So we know that Islam, or one of the meanings of the word Islam itself, comes from the word salam in Arabic, which means peace. And one of our core beliefs as Muslims is to be a peaceful group of people, and we know there are rules to engaging in conflict or warfare with other groups of people, and those rules are very clearly stated in the Quran and also in the Sunnah. And the actions of groups that are considered terrorists in today's age are, I think there's general consensus amongst Muslims, or amongst main groups of Muslims, that these actions are not reflective of these criteria of engaging in warfare or engaging in conflict. So these are actually transgressions that are past the requirements of warfare that have been very clearly laid out for us. And I think another way to approach this question, if somebody is claiming that you or I am a terrorist, is to ask them to consider who I personally am. So I guess this would also depend on the context, who you're talking to or what the situation is. But if this is somebody for example, in your school, then you both are students, and you might ask them to consider how you as a student can be a terrorist, or what they define as terrorism, and how you possibly could be engaged in such action. But that's one way to answer it on an individual or personal level. But to bring it to the general Muslim-wide level, I think one way to respond to the question would be, as I stated, to mention these specific rules of engaging in warfare. And maybe Brother Ahmed could help me out later with what the specific rules are, because I can't. I'm not exactly sure of
We don't have to wait until
rules.
later. I can jump in right now, inshallah.
Okay.
All right. So, Sister Reem, I would actually answer this kind of a question in the reverse order that Brother Abdullah did. I would start, and this is kind of a general thing. When someone says, why are you all terrorists, or why are you a terrorist? Punch it back in his, not punch it back. Like a tennis, bounce the ball back, return the serve, and say, what makes you think, or why do you think I'm a terrorist? Like, we usually say in Dawah, you don't want to take things personally, but this is a positive way of making it personally, saying, how am I, Reem or Ahmed or Abdul, how am I a terrorist? Ask them, put that back in their court. How am I a terrorist? And if they start sluttering, it's like, oh, well, it's not you. I'm pretty sure you're fine. But like your people. I was like, okay, how are my people terrorists? Like, get them to define it. Again, you want to keep them on the back foot so they're not just taking over your life, right? How am I a terrorist? Well, not you, you haven't done anything, but your family or your people. How are my people terrorists? Tell me, what is it that they've done? What have they done to you? It's like, oh, they've done this, that, and the other thing. They've bombed this, they've bombed that. It's like, well, my parents didn't do that. My family didn't do that. My country didn't do that. In fact, if you happen to live in Syria or Turkey or Iraq, you can say, in fact, my family, my cousins and those who are, from my hometown, they, suffered more from this. So again, how are we being terrorists? Get them to say, oh, because this group says this, like Boko Haram or Daesh. You know what I'm saying? You start with personal. They say, oh, because of your family. Okay, then what has my family done? Oh no, what I meant is your country. Okay, what has my country done? Oh well, they did this. Like, no, my country didn't do that. It was this particular. Get them to say this particular group is the one that did it. You have to get them to actually say it's this group or that group or this group, and they say that group is not representative of all Muslims. They're actually going against the teachings of the Prophet, may peace be upon him. And all the scholars have said that. A question like this, Brother Abdullah, you have to cut it quick. If you take too long in explaining, you're going to lose credibility. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So when someone asks you or Sister Reem, oh, why are y'all terrorists? That's like a loaded question. Or they call you, hey, you're a terrorist. Like, you just said, how am I a terrorist? What have I done? Right? And then they say, well, I didn't mean you. I mean, like, your people. Okay, what have my people done? It's like, oh, they did this, then they bombed the Twin Towers. It's like, okay, that wasn't my country. Who did that? Who did that? And they said, oh, these 19 people. It's like, okay, great. Guess what? The people the country that those people came from denounced them and condemned them, and they said that they are actually violating the teachings of our Prophet and of the Quran. You have to get to that point where they say this group did it, and you say, we've already said that's not the teachings of Islam. You see what I'm saying?
Thank you, brother.
Alhamdulillah. Did that help, Reem?
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. All right, so I'll turn myself off again. Other questions, inshallah, for Brother Abdullah.
This is a question that I have for you, brother Head. Maybe after we're done, you can have a go and try to. We'll see how you might answer this specific question that I try to answer. But I found this to be kind of a philosophical question, and I was trying to find concrete pieces of evidence like you have in your slides, but I had difficulty doing so. So would you take more of a more of a concrete approach to answering this question, like you do in these sessions where you have specific pieces of evidence from the Quran and the Hadith? And
you mean about the terrorist question or the question
about the injustice question that I answered? Because one reason I avoided doing that was because if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't approve or doesn't really acknowledge the validity of the Quran or the Hadith, then they might not necessarily be open to accepting these as facts.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. Let's see if I can. So when it comes to the injustice question, I like to go to. So first, what I usually do is I go to Surah Al-Mulk, and then I give a kind of like my very insta quick tafsir of Surah Al-Mulk. Surah Al-Mulk says, "Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk, wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir." The first ayah is kind of an introduction. Blessed is he in whose hand is the dominion, and he is capable of all things. But it's the second ayah that answers the question. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. The one, blessed is he who created death and life to test you who is the best in conduct. That's the verse that I start with. And then I give my instant tafsir that says, brother, or man, God did not put us on this earth to eat, drink, and be merry. And all of the questions about the injustice in this world is the false assumption that the purpose of this worldly life is to eat and drink and be happy, right? The pursuit of happiness. That's not the point of this world. The hereafter, the akhirah, Jannah, that's the purpose of Jannah, to eat and drink and have as much happiness as you want, right? This dunya is a place of testing. And therefore, we have no reason to expect that we will have all things to eat and all things to drink and always be happy. Allah says that He created death and life to test us who will be best in conduct. And therefore, our worldly life has to have tough situations and good situations so that we can be tested across the entire spectrum. Are we grateful in the good times? Are we patient in the bad times? Do we have faith when it seems like everything has been lost and that we've lost, that everything's going wrong, right? Like the story of Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam, Job. He was a pious man. He was a prophet. He had his wife, he had his children, he had his cattle, he had his money, he had his lands, he had all of this. And Allah took everything away except his wife. But yet he was still a grateful servant. He still kept the faith. That's the test. See? And you can't say that we are being tested more than Prophet Job. He lost his health. He was sitting in bed with boils on his back and everything else. He lost all of his children. They all died. He lost all of his farms and cattle and livestock. He lost all of his lands. He lost all of his wealth. He even lost all of the respect that the people in the community had for him. So he was in physical pain, financially destitute. All of his children died in front of his, before him. That's the toughest thing for a parent. Parents are like, I want to die and see you, married or have children or whatever, right? All the parents, they say that. They would rather that they die, but their children live on. Your own son or you bury your own daughter. It's painful. And he lost the respect of the people around him. They were looking at him like, oh, he must have been doing some secret sin, and that's why Allah is punishing him. You say, look, the problem of evil, the justification for suffering, the existence of injustice, it all comes down to the presumption, the wrong presumption that the Quran mentions in more than one place, but I like Surah Al-Mulk because I have it memorized and I can say it right away. Allah did not create death and life except to test you. So we understand that this worldly life is going to be a test. You're going to have good times, you're going to have bad times. And Allah wants to see, are you going to be grateful and humble when you're in the high good times? And are you going to be patient and repentant when you go through the bad times? Yes, there will be people who will go through hunger. Yes, there will be people who will be unjustly imprisoned. Yes, there will be people who will be maimed unjustly or killed for no reason or raped or driven out of their lands or all of these things. Yes, we know that's going to happen. Allah has prepped us for this. This is a dar al-ibtula. This is the house of testing. And if you remember what the word fitna means, the actual Arabic word fitna, fatana is the process by which a goldsmith takes the raw gold ore out of the earth and he puts it in a fire so that all of the pure gold rises and all of the worthless junk that's attached to it sinks. So our hearts, our whole souls are going to be going through this fitna process. لَقَدْ فَتَنَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. Allah says, we did fitna, we applied fitna to the people before you. So we can see who is true and who's lying. That'll be my answer, inshallah.
Thank you very much.
All right, we got about 4 minutes, inshallah ta'ala. Do we have any other questions for Brother Abdullah?
I have a follow-up question for what you just said.
Go ahead.
So you said that in Source of Market it says that we only created death and life to see what you're gonna do.
Yes.
So I've brought that up before, and commonly they would say, doesn't God know everything? Why would he want to see what you're gonna do if he already knows? So what would you say to that?
So it's not so that God could know. It's so that it can be known. That means you. Because if God put people in paradise, and in fact, Dr. Omar Abdul Kafi, he had a comment about this once. He said, Allah could have created all the people, looked into their futures, and knows who are the people of Jannah, who are the people of hellfire, and just directly registered them into their places. Then they said, but I didn't do anything. No, you would have. And Allah has infinite knowledge. They said, but I didn't do it. Right? It's like the whole Minority Report movie, right? I didn't do it. But we know you're going to do it. No, but I didn't do it. It's to put the hujjah. That's what the purpose of this life is. So the hujjah of those who experienced calamity and were patient, they have that in their hujjah. And those who experienced prosperity and they were zalim with it, they had the money, they had the wealth, they had the power, and they were, oppressing people or committing injustice left and right because they thought they could pay their way past God, right? That's the hujjah against them. Or those who were put into a test of losing their child or losing their parent or losing, their sister, and they say, no, I was patient. Or there are those who lost their daughter, and they left Islam. They say, how could Allah do this to me? Why me? So that's the hujjah against them. See? So it's not لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ, to test you, أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. It's not so Allah needs to know. It's so that Allah can show the proof for you, hujjah against you or for you. That's the point. Does that make sense, Mr. Reem?
Yes, thank you.
Fair, inshallah. All right, I really don't want to be on the hotspot here. Abdullah is supposed to be on the hotspot for the next 2 minutes.
I have a question, but it might not make that much sense.
Okay, we like all questions.
So if there's good in the world, and like in the dunya there's like mata', and then there's also things that are not so nice, it's so that we could have an idea of what's coming up if we do go to Jannah. But why is there justice in the dunya and the akhirah? Like some justice in the dunya. So what's the purpose of trying to achieve some justice here?
That's a very, very good question. MashaAllah, sister. Abdullah, go ahead.
Yeah. So once again, this may be incorrect, but I'll just say what I think is right. I believe that the reason there is justice and injustice, or the juxtaposition of justice and injustice in this world, might be one reason might be as a source of hope. So if there's only injustice in this world, then the injustice will just become normal, and there might not be motivation to try to do our part to bringing the injustice to an end and bring about justice, which, as I mentioned, is also a test. If we see injustice, to try to reverse it to become justice. That's all I have, Brother Ahmed. What do you think?
That's pretty much what I would say. You're actually very close. That the idea is that it's out of the mercy of Allah to allow us to have a bit of hope. That it's not all roses, like some of the people who have the whole issue about injustice in this world and suffering and evil in the world. It's because they have too much hope that Allah will just make our dunya very nice. But also we don't want the other side, which is despair. In that there is, this is kind of what Buddhists have, in that this world is all nothing but suffering, and you have to, be reincarnated and detach yourself a certain number of times, or be reincarnated so many times until you no longer are attached to the dunya at all, right? That's kind of the Buddhist philosophy, is that this world is nothing but suffering, right? There is no justice. Don't even expect it. Just let it go, right? And then the idea is that you're going to keep being reincarnated over and over and over until you get that through your, until you get that into your soul. And then you can stop being reincarnated and then you're done. But Islam doesn't go to either extremes. Islam, subhanAllah, when you start looking at all the other philosophies and religions in the world, you really see how this is ummatan wasatan. This is the middle path. We don't have the abundance of hope like those who have unfair expectations of Allah. And at the same time, we don't have this kind of bleak despair, or I don't want to say bleak, but fatalistic resignation that there's nothing good in this dunya. There's nothing, don't even expect any justice in this dunya. Allah has given us a balance so He can test us, so that we can try to achieve that justice. and that we are incensed and outraged when we see the injustice. It's so that the human soul can be dynamic and active. And that's really what, Islam is a deen of activism. As Brother Abdullah had mentioned, the hadith of the Prophet, if you see something wrong with when you see something evil, you should try to change it with your hand. If you can't do that, you speak out against it with your tongue. And if you can't do that, you should despise it in your heart, and that's the weakest part of faith, right? So the point of having a little bit of justice is to have that aspirational, dynamic, the soul of the person in this dunya, if they're awake and they're perceptive and not just, dulling their senses with drugs and alcohol and entertainment or running after wealth and power and prestige. If the person is actually being thoughtful and using their soul and their mind for the purpose that Allah gave them, they will have that dynamic, you use it or you lose it. If you don't see a hope, if you don't see justice can be implemented in our lifetime, like what happened with the prophets, all of them, alayhimus salam. Every prophet that had political power, like Moses and David and Sulaiman and Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, they all had the fruits of that. They were struggling and striving to achieve justice in the dunya. And for some brief moments, they achieved it, right? That's the point, is that it's a hope. Allah, out of His mercy, has opened the door, a ray of light, to give people hope that they can look back at their own lives. There was a time when we were able to achieve justice, or even in their history, in their civilizations, or the previous nations. It's not all doom and gloom, but it is possible for the human being, collectively and individually, to be empowered, not just to seek justice, but to actually achieve it. But it takes work. And that's what jihad is all about.
One last question before we close. I received the question of why many Muslim countries seem to have more injustice than non-Muslim countries. So why is there so much war, famine, and poverty in Muslim nations? And the way I would approach the question is by making the distinction between political and religious or cultural reasons. So a lot of the injustice we see in Muslim countries has a lot of historical factors that have been going on for many years that have set the stage for the injustice, and then I would probably steer away from the political conversation and try to take it back to a religious conversation. But is there any other points you'd add?
No, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? Just like the sister who was asking before about, why did things go away? Or the brother, actually, when he asked about slavery, why didn't it go away? If like everything was set up, all the rules and the checks and balances, slavery should have disappeared. Why didn't it? It's like, well, it did at 2 points in history. In the time of Umar al-Khattab, it disappeared. But then other people took control. They were not as pious. They were not as concerned about justice. They weren't hungering for justice like Umar al-Khattab. And so they went slack and they allowed it to come back in. And greed and hunger for power came back into the forefront of the leadership, right? And then Umar ibn Abdul Aziz came into power, and he did a strong job of trying to revive the sunnah of the Prophet and of the companions. And he did for a short time, but then after he died, it's still there on the screen. After he died, then it kind of went back to the old way. And this history of Muslim civilization, it has these rise and falls, where you have people who collect, you have the leader who does it himself, but he also has the collective, right? He has the people who are following him who buy into this, like Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, right? There was a lot of injustice. And many people said that the reason why, the Muslims were kicked out of the Holy Land back in those days is because of their failure to seek justice, right? Allah says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُومُوا لِلَّهِ قِسْطٍ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُومُوا بِالْقِسْطِ لِلَّهِ شُهَدَاءَ. O you who believe, stand firm for justice as a witness to Allah. You see? So Allah has commanded us to seek justice and establish it. But not many people can actually do that, right? There are people who let their greed or their power come to it. So yes, you explain that we've had ups and downs, and we're just in a down period right now. It happened before in our history, and it will happen again. But we also had the rise, right? We have epics, we have particular parts of our rich heritage in history, where yes, the people collectively and their leaders became committed to establishing justice on this dunya as Allah commanded us to do. And when that happens, then you see a totally different situation. Khair, inshallah. So I'll go ahead and close out here. One more thing, inshallah, before we close out, I do want to remind everybody here, and I'm going to actually put it in the chat, inshallah ta'ala, about the, hold on a second, let's just do this,